Hello, everyone. Welcome to online lecture 4. So normally I have all of your reading assignments already posted in your Zoom guide. However, I didn't include this one, which I would like you to read for this lecture on ethics. And this is the APA Ethics Code for Researchers. Now, there is a whole long APA ethics code that this link will take you to. You do not need to read that whole long code. I am only asking that you read section 8, okay? And that pertains to ethics code for researchers, okay, and publication. It's not the whole thing, just section 8. Okay, so please read that in addition to your textbook assignment. And as I mentioned, today we're going to be discussing research ethics. So we're going to get into a little bit of the history, a little bit of some of the codes that have been established over time, as well as some current issues. Okay. So research ethics, what are they? Well, they're a set of guidelines to assist the researcher in conducting ethical research. Okay. So we might all think and hope that we don't need such guidelines, that we know what ethics are and we can be very ethical in our research. And I would say probably that there's some truth to that for a lot of people. But, you know, different people have different ideas about what may or may not be ethical. So it is handy to have some coding, some laws around this, around research. So it's actually a really nice thing to have such a set of guidelines. Okay. So let's talk about the relationship between science and society. For example, how about government funding of scientific research? Well, this is an issue because there can be congressional influence on which studies are funded. And I'll give you an example such as AIDS research. There was a time when it was really not a topic that people wanted to acknowledge or pursue in research, and it received very, very little funding from the government. So the government really didn't want to acknowledge this disease, didn't want to give any credence to it, and funding was sparse. Then there came a time where the opposite happened, where it was really, really considered the thing to research. It received all kinds of funds, et cetera, et cetera. I would guess right now that pandemics are hot on the list of items that that would get some funding around research. I don't know that for a fact, but you know, especially COVID-19, you know, everyone's researching that at the moment. So, you know, it really depends what's going on sometimes in the moment as to how much attention it gets. Okay. There's also corporate funding of scientific research, and yeah, that's a little bit iffy. It often comes up with drug research, and there can be a conflict of interest with researchers' activities that can lead to a public distrust of science. So, for example, if a corporation came to you and hired you, they would like you to test out and do some research regarding their latest, greatest drug, drug A. Um, and you go ahead and take on this project for them as a well-known researcher, what you may find is that they are not really interested in you finding any bad results. They only want you to show positive results about this drug. And that can put you in a kind of a sticky situation. So corporate funding it can be done well, but it can be a really tricky area. Okay. Next, let's talk about professional issues such as research misconduct. So fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism in proposing, performing, or reviewing research or in reporting research results. That is one definition that's given to us. from the Office of Science and Technology Policy around what research misconduct is. Okay, so fabrication would just be plain old making up the data or results. Falsification would be potentially modifying or changing numbers. And plagiarism, as I suspect many of you are aware of, would be copying someone else's work. Treatment of research participants. So this is probably the most fundamental issue confronted by scientists. How do we treat our participants appropriately? Because technically all participants could be at risk for some physical or psychological harm. And so scientists are obligated to consider the ethics of conducting the necessary research. And we'll continue to talk about that issue because that's a really big one. You know, how much harm is okay? How much risk is okay? You know, can we ask questions that might cause any kind of discomfort? One issue that's often come up is suicide research. And the fear is often that if we ask someone, you know, are you thinking about suicide, that it will cause them to think about and potentially even commit suicide. Now, that has been shown through the research to really not be the case. That it's not a, oh, I never thought of that before, but that's a great idea, thank you, goodbye. It's not that kind of experience. Usually people who are thinking about it are thinking about it, and people who aren't going to be suddenly swayed to think about it by simply asking the question. So, but this was a concern for a long time, and even today, I think sometimes remains a concern that we might cause harm by asking the question, and is that okay or not? So it's important to know when that's a real truth and when we actually can ask the question and we can conduct the important research. Okay. So let's talk about some background. And I won't go into all of these in great detail, like, for example, the World War II Nazi inhumane research. I think probably a number of you know about this, know that there was a good deal of not humane research being conducted during this time period. Just some general, I'm interested in learning about this, so I have some people here who I don't really consider people, and so it's okay to conduct this kind of research. Milgram's obedience experiment. I will tell you a little bit more about this one. This was an interesting study, and some of you may already know about this. But basically the way it worked is that that there was someone dressed up in a lab coat, and they were supposed to be the one in charge of the study. And then there were two people who came in, one who was supposed to be the randomly designated as the teacher, one who would be randomly designated as the learner. Now, this was a farce. This was a setup. The learner was actually a Confederate in the study and was always chosen to be the learner. Okay, so the teacher thought that they were randomly chosen to be the teacher. No, it was rigged that way. Okay, so now the teacher is placed in front of a large row of electric shocks. Okay, and it starts off with pretty mild shocks to the left, and then as you go up the line toward the right, the shocks become more and more intense until all the way at the right there's even warning signs about the level of shocks. Okay. All right. So the learner is supposedly hooked to the shock machine, and the shock machine went from 15 to 450, I believe. Like I said, there were different signs of slight, moderate, danger, severe shock, and a red XXX above 400. And the question is, how far would the teachers go in administering the shocks when the person in the lab coat said, hey, they got it wrong, you got to administer the next highest shock. Or they got it wrong again, now go higher. And they got it wrong again, go higher. How far would people go before they said, no, I don't care, I'm not doing this anymore? And they found that about 65% of participants went to 450. And so this was a very important study and interesting result about obedience. But was it ethical? Was it ethical? And I think by today's standards, we would probably say this study could not be conducted. While no one got shocked, the teacher, who was the actual participant in the study, I'm sure had some feelings about, feeling like they had gone through and shocked this other person. Okay. Little Albert. Little Albert. So as you can see, I have a link here that you can go to and look more about Little Albert, but I'll just give you a really brief summary. Little Albert was a little baby, and the baby was your typical baby without much in the way of fears about different things, including a white rat. And what they did is they presented the white rat, no fear, no problem, and then they would bang something really loud when they presented the white rat. And through conditioning, what happened is that the baby started to associate the white rat with the loud sound and would start crying to just see the white rat, even when it wasn't in the presence of any loud sound. So they made that association and started crying whenever they saw a white rat. And then not only that, but it generalized. It generalized to a white rabbit and even to like a Santa Claus beard. So again, we question the ethics of that kind of study today. Tuskegee syphilis study. Now this study went on from 1932 to 1972, which I personally find shocking, and I'll tell you why. The U.S. Public Health Service conducted research on the effects of untreated syphilis on Black men in Macon County, Alabama. Now, the Public Health Service was deceptive in its recruitment by offering free physical exams and treatment for other ailments. However, they were not clear about their not being treated for syphilis. They also told local physicians not to give them treatment for syphilis, and participants who were offered treatment were told they would be dropped from the study and its benefits. And maybe that's part of why today in our rules and our codes, we usually say that, hey, even if a person drops out of our study, they still can get all the benefits of the study. It's not really the right thing to do to say, oh, you suddenly don't get this health care that you really need and are getting through this study. Okay. Henrietta Lacks and HeLa cells. There's a wonderful kind of an easy read around this if you're interested. It's a great story to read about and to learn more about this issue. So in 1951, a poor Black woman named Henrietta Lacks dies of cervical cancer. But pieces of the tumor that killed her were taken without her knowledge or consent and then live on. First in one lab, then in hundreds, then thousands, then in giant factories churning out polio vaccines, then aboard rocket ships launched into space. The cells from this one tumor would spawn a multi-billion-dollar industry, become a foundation of modern science, leading to breakthroughs in gene mapping, cloning, and fertility, and helping to discover how viruses work and how cancer develops, among a million other things. Henrietta's cells have been bought and sold by the billions, yet she remains virtually unknown, and her family can afford health insurance to care for the diseases their mother's cells have helped to cure. So that's another really interesting study. Now they did nothing they gave Henrietta Lacks appropriate care while she was alive, but when she died, they thought it would be interesting to take her cancer cells, her tumor, and study them. And just so happened that they were kind of unique in that they did live on, and like I said, spawned all this other research. So really tough issue there too. Lancet. Lancet is a really well-known journal, and it's the journal in which the one study that linked the MMR vaccine to autism was published. Okay. Now, when they started looking into this study a lot more, they saw that there were pretty sketchy ethical practices going on. For example, one reports that the blood may have been obtained at a birthday party, like not necessarily, using appropriate recruitment techniques. There were financial incentives to discredit the MMR vaccine. So in other words, this person running the study was financially motivated to discredit, to show that the MMR vaccine was not good. There were poor methods conducted and poor reporting overall. So this person who actually published a study has faced some consequences as a result of this. Okay. Unfortunately, hundreds of studies later, and all showing not a link between MMR vaccine and autism, but people are still frightened because of the one study. So it's an unfortunate piece in science. Okay. So now let's talk a little bit about the history of ethical guidelines. Okay. So in 1946, we had the Nuremberg Code, and it was the result of the World War II Nazi inhumane research. In 1953, we have the APA Ethical Principles of Psychologists and Code of Conduct, the first version of this. You'll, of course, be reading the most recent version, but this was the very first version. In 1979, there was the Belmont Report that included ethical principles and guidelines for the protection of human subjects of research. So you might notice that some of these seem to be reactions to what has happened in our society, in our culture, that were unethical activities. And if you're thinking that, you're on track, because yeah, a lot of these are reactionary. Okay. Let me actually say just a few more words about the Belmont Report, and then we'll move on to the next piece. So for the Belmont Report, there were three main principles that they wanted to instill: beneficence, autonomy, and justice. Beneficence, autonomy, and justice. And beneficence has to do with do no harm and maximize the benefits while minimizing the harms. Okay, that sounds a little contradictory at first, right? So we're trying to basically maximize benefit, minimize harm, and not do anything that's considered too harmful. Okay, so that's beneficence. Autonomy. Respect for persons incorporates at least two ethical convictions. First, individuals should be treated autonomously. And second, that people with diminished autonomy are entitled to protection. So in other words, you want to treat people as if they're autonomous beings, that they can make a decision as to whether or not they want to be involved in your research. And if someone has diminished autonomy, now what do we mean about that? Now, for example, the people in the Tuskegee syphilis study, they really needed healthcare. And so the inducement of healthcare was a bit high. And maybe in some ways you can almost argue that they had some diminished autonomy there. Another place where you can where you can probably see it even better would be in prisons. There might be some diminished autonomy, and so we might have to provide extra protection, and we do when we're doing research with prisoners. Okay. Third one is justice. Okay. So each person should have an equal share. Each person according to individual need. Each person according to individual effort. Each person according to societal contribution. And each person according to merit. Okay. So those are general overarching principles. I think you'll see in reading the APA Ethics Code that it gets a little more specific, which is helpful. I think because some of these can be a little bit, how do we interpret that? What's the rule that really matches up with this ideal? Okay. Okay. So one ethical dilemma, and the big one we often have, as we talked about earlier on, is deciding if the benefit of the research is greater than the cost to the participants. So you're always considering that cost-benefit ratio, with the primary consideration always being the welfare of the participant. So as you can see, continued emphasis on the participant here, continued emphasis on maximizing benefit, minimizing harm. Maximizing benefit, minimizing cost, same idea. Okay. All right. So, how do we do things these days? Research is presented to the Institutional Review Board for review of cost-benefit ratio. The IRB, or Institutional Review Board, exists at all institutions that receive federal funding, and it only reviews research involving human participants. So two pieces there. First of all, Westchester, yes, we do have an IRB, and it does review all research that are conducted involving human participants. Fortunately, because you guys are part of a class, and fortunately, in addition, because you guys will not actually be collecting any data from humans, you are considered free of this requirement. You're exempt. You do not have to submit your ideas to the IRB, and that would take too long. It wouldn't actually work in a class like this. So I will be reviewing all of your methods to make sure that they're ethical and that they meet standards. And as long as they do, you should be in good shape to move on to the next part of your study and actually get some results. Okay. There is another place or agency that reviews research involving animals. I know that's a very kind of conflicted subject. Some people are pro-animal research and some people are very much against it. And we'll talk about, a little bit later on actually, we'll talk about how animal research gets reviewed. But it's not the same as the IRB. Okay. Okay, so each institution that receives federal funds must have an IRB, as I mentioned, and the IRB, the group, is responsible for reviewing the research. They must have at least 5 members, and 1 member must be from outside the institution. Interesting, right? Why do we want 1 member from outside the institution? Well, here's a reason. Let's say your institution got a $2 million grant to study music and learning. So, and the person is going through the process of applying for their IRB. They've already been awarded the grant. It might be that members of the IRB could feel a little bit of bias toward wanting to move this study forward, so that the institution, and whenever an individual researcher gets a grant, the institution gets a nice piece of that grant, and the institution might be eager to get that money. And I'm not saying it would make them biased, but it could. It's always that. So just to make sure, just to be certain that there's no bias, we have someone from outside the institution. Right. And same if, let's say it's a person who is not very popular at the institution and maybe isn't going to get through, you want that outsider to make sure that everyone gets a fair shake. Okay. And as I mentioned, all research conducted by students, faculty, and staff must be reviewed, but you guys are the exception to the rule because of the nature of the class and because of the nature of you not collecting any data. Okay. Let's talk about types of research in the IRB. There's three main categories. There's exempt research, which is no risk of harm, no review needed. There's minimal risk research. The risk of harm is no greater than the risk encountered in daily life or routine physical or psychological tests, and it's routine review conducted by the IRB. Okay. So your typical psychological tests might be cognitive tests, might be quality of life, might be about personality. Those sort of things would probably be under the minimal risk research. Greater than minimal risk research. Thorough review conducted by the IRB. Now, if you're doing some really sensitive psychological research, maybe research on trauma or those sort of things, and also a lot of physical research, if you're taking blood, those sort of things, that's when that kind of goes to that category, the greater than minimal risk research category. Okay. So what is the IRB's impact on research? Well, one impact is that it takes longer for approval of studies. And I'll just share an example with you. I've had a study that's been waiting to run for probably since March, actually. And what happened is the IRB did their job, and they did a nice job of reviewing my study and giving it approval, but they approved it right before spring break, and right after spring break is when COVID happened. So now we have to go through the process. I think everyone is in this boat of having to go through the process of reapplying to put the study online, or we just wait until we're back all in person again. So, but it can extend the time for approval of study. Submissions often need to be revised or clarified, and they're very cautious around approval. So just to put it out there, some have argued the IRB might go too far sometimes. And like I was sharing before about the suicide research, again, for good reason on their part, they might be very worried about permitting that kind of research or trauma research to be conducted. But if the research shows that asking about trauma is okay, it does not harm the participant, asking about suicide is okay, does not harm the participant, then we need to go forward with that kind of research. Okay, so those are the kind of impacts that IRB can have on research. Ethical issues when conducting research. APA ethical principles and psychology code of conduct. There are 10 standards of conduct, and like I said, it's standard 8 that I want you to look at around research and publication. There are 5 general principles to the APA ethics code. Beneficence, maximize benefits and minimize harm. Responsibility, integrity, justice, and respect for the rights and dignity of others. Okay. So, according to the APA Ethics Code, Standard 8, we have to have an IRB approval for studies to move forward. We have to also have informed consent, which means fully informing participants of all aspects of the study. Now, that can be tricky because you want to inform them of the purpose, the procedures, the risks, the benefits, so that the participant can make an informed decision to participate or decline. But what if you're afraid in our music and learning study? What if you're afraid that by telling them that we think that the music is going to make the difference in how well you perform, that just by telling them it influences the study? Because that can happen. Well, then we have to be careful and find these ways around those kinds of issues. So one way is that in certain cases you are allowed to dispense with informed consent when the integrity of the data may be compromised, and when there are specific and limited conditions when there'll be no distress or harm to the participants, or when permitted by law. So let's go through that. When the integrity of the data may be compromised. So in other words, if you have a situation where, okay, I'm going to tell them as much as I can, but I'm just not going to tell them that it's the music that may make a difference. That may be something you do around that issue. Okay. If you determine that this learning and cognition study absolutely poses no harm, and sometimes if it's the only piece of paper that's going to have their name, it makes more sense to not have them sign an informed consent form, because that's the only thing linking them to the study. Okay. And finally, when permitted by law, sometimes we dispense with informed consent. Okay, so let's talk about this next issue, minors, consent versus assent. So minors, first of all, who is considered a minor can vary state by state. Okay, so we have to be aware of that. But let's say minor, in many states as it is anyone under 18 years of age. Then a minor can't give full informed consent, which is what we need to run a study. What they can give is what's called assent. They're agreeing to the study, and then the parent or legal guardian has to actually give the informed consent to do this. Okay. There's also something called passive versus active consent. Now, active consent would be the kind of situation that I was addressing before, where there's an informed consent and they're actively usually signing a piece of paper saying, yes, I consent to this study. Passive consent, what if you are, and this is an issue more nowadays, what if you're conducting a study online and it's not reasonable to get an electronic signature? Maybe passive consent is when you say, if you agree to the study, please click enter to move on to the next step. That would be more of a passive consent. Okay. Deception. What about deception in studies? Well, I kind of already hinted at that, right? When I was saying, what if you don't want them to know which kind, that you think that classical music will lead to better memory, that it's the music that you think makes the difference. You might go ahead and not tell people about all aspects of the study, right? So you might go ahead and introduce deception as long as it is only for the purpose of conducting your study and will not cause any undue harm. And then what you'll want to do if you do any deception, or even if you don't, is do what's called a post-experimental interview or debriefing. This occurs after the completion of the study. It explains why the deception was necessary and provides additional resources if necessary. So sometimes people provide resources such as here's the name and number for, or a web address for a counseling center in case you would like to discuss any of the issues that may have come up in this study any further. Okay, so that could be one kind of resource you might provide. Okay. Let's go on. Let's talk a little bit about inducements. What can you do reasonably to encourage people to participate in your study? Is it okay to give them $1? Is it okay to give them a $5 Amazon gift card? Is it okay to give them $1,000? What's too much of an inducement, right? And too much of an inducement can be considered coercion. So you have to think about who your participants are, right? College students, maybe $5 is reasonable, maybe $100 is too much of an inducement. Prisoners, I don't know, depends, but maybe even $5 or $10 is too much there. Okay. So you can give inducements, and there are IRB rules around this, but you have to be thoughtful about what is too much to offer a participant that almost makes them feel like they are coerced or have to participate. Okay. And of course, we want to make sure that our participants are never coerced, that they always feel free to decline participation, and even that they may still receive some or all of the benefits of the study if they do decline participation. For example, I am hoping to run my study this semester, and I am allowing my participants to say after they read the informed consent, no, this isn't for me, I'm going to decline, and they're still going to get their experimental credit that they need for their class. Okay. So let's talk about the difference between confidentiality and anonymity as well as privacy. Privacy has to do with the control of others' access to information about participants. So you want to keep your data private, right? You want to make sure that just not anyone can access that information. Now, some studies actually allow for anonymity, which means keeping the participant's identity unknown. Now that may be the case for our learning and music study. Really, why do we need the person's name? We might be interested in some demographic characteristics because that could make a difference. But why do we really need the person's name? Maybe we can keep that unknown. Whereas confidentiality is not revealing or connecting the participant to the information obtained. Now, let's say with your learning study, you want to actually look if it's going to change over time. So you have Susan Smith take the study on one day with classical music, and then you have them come back. You have them come back and take the test with pop music. Same person. Well, you might want to track Susan Smith's results to see if they change between classical and pop music, right? If there's anything over time, it makes it more difficult to allow for anonymity. You have to, because you have to be able to connect their results over time. You might have to have just a confidential study. Okay. In terms of humane care and use of animals in research, there's something called animal welfare versus animal rights. And APA only deals with animal welfare. Now remember, this is different than IRB. IRB didn't deal with animals at all, but APA does address animal welfare. So animal welfare involves improving lab conditions, reducing the number of animals used, those sort of things. Whereas animal rights is the belief that non-human animals have similar rights to humans. So two different things, they're two different concepts, and APA does not address the issue of animal rights. This does not mean it's not an important or interesting issue, it's just they're only focused on animal welfare. Okay. So how about writing, reporting of results, publication, presentation? Basically, you want to be honest whenever you publish or present your results. There can be authorship issues. It can be a really hard thing. And I encourage you, if any of you become involved in research and there's going to be posters or publications, to be upfront and just try to find out early on whether you'll be considered for authorship or what that would entail. Sometimes it used to be the case that young professors would have a hard time getting the first place authorship position. And in psychology, that makes a difference. The first place authorship position usually has done the most work, followed by second, followed by third, et cetera, et cetera. So it used to be a challenge for young professors to get that, and usually the old professors the more practiced, more senior professors or people in the field would take that first position. And then they changed the rules a little bit, made it kind of clever, where they had a senior researcher position, which was at the end. Allowed more young authors to get first authorship positions. Okay. In other fields, the order doesn't matter. In mathematics, the order doesn't matter. They just go alphabetically. So it totally depends on your field. But in psychology, it is an interesting issue. Generally, you know, a student might hope to get onto a presentation, onto a poster presentation or something like that if they're lucky. Publication would be more rare, but you never know. Okay. Plagiarism. We talked about plagiarism a little bit before. This is an issue, unfortunately, in publication. In fact, I came across this. I had this research professor, okay? She was my ethics professor. And she was discussing how one time a student came up to her and said, "Look at this article." And she looks, she says, "Well, this is my article. Yeah, I wrote this." And they're like, "Yes, but that's not your name." So someone had literally taken her article, word for word, copied it, changed the author, and that was it, and sent it to a new journal. And unfortunately, that journal missed it and published it. So that person who stole the ethics professor's article did not land well. So bad idea to steal from an ethics professor, right? That wasn't good. So plagiarism is an unfortunate issue. It does come up in publication and presentation, but we're hoping to continue to avoid it as much as possible, and you know, hoping that our field continues to get better around this issue. Okay. How about electronic research? Now, we talked about the passive consent idea. That might be how you have to do informed consent in electronic research, right? You might have to say, if you agree to this, please click the next slide. Privacy. Privacy, you know, that's a tougher issue, right? How are you going to guarantee privacy when you do online type of research? And there may be some ways to do it, especially if you use like something like Qualtrics as a online survey generator. That would be a great way to try and help. They store the data in a more private way, so it's less likely to be hacked, those sort of things. But it's a lot harder to control your online research. What's to prevent a person from doing the research multiple times? What's to prevent a person from, usually a person, if they're in front of you, are less likely to get up in the middle of the experiment and leave, but not online. Online, oh, I'm bored, I'll leave. And finally, debriefing. That's an issue too, because how do you guarantee that the person sticks around for debriefing at the end? Right? You can't. So it becomes a difficult issue there too. Okay. Finally, I would like you to consider the following scenario. Suppose participants are given false feedback about an unfavorable personality trait or low ability level. What are the ethical issues raised by this procedure? So think about that. We can talk about it in person on our ethics day, but that can be an issue, right? Giving some people, telling them they have the very, very low math ability maybe, or something like that. Compare your reactions to that procedure with your reactions to an analogous one in which people are given false feedback that they possess a very favorable personality trait or a very high ability level. How do you react to that? Is it the same? Is it different? What are your thoughts? Okay, so think about those two things. That's all I have for you for today. Have a great one, and I'll see you next time.